Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to start the third part of our abiotic and biotic factors lesson. And in this third section, we are taking a look at how it is that biotic and abiotic factors can limit various populations and affect populations and their size. And so we're going to take a look at that, how that can happen today. We've been working on answering these questions here. Number one, what are the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem? And then number two, how do organisms and populations in an organism depend on and compete for biotic and abiotic factors? And so it's more of the second question that we are continuing to take a look at in today's lesson. I want you to take a look at this particular slide here for just a moment. So our question asks us, what would happen if 2 mice produced 56 baby mice every year? And then each of these mice had 56 babies each year. And it wants you to calculate the total mice born in 1 year started by the original pair. Well, I'm not going to actually ask you to do this calculation, although you're welcome to on your own if you would like. But let's just say that, well, there would be an awful lot of mice, right? The planet would be overrun by mice. So the question becomes, why is it when we walk around we're not constantly stepping on mice, right? Why is it that we are not overrun by them if they have this many babies all the time? And the reality is because there are a lot of things that limit how many of these mice actually survive, right? And so that's what we're going to kind of take a look at today. We're going to start by taking a look at something called carrying capacity. What is carrying capacity? Well, it is the largest number of individuals of the same species that an area can support. Every ecosystem has a limit to how many of any one species that it can support. It only has so much food for that particular species. It only has so much space. There are a lot of things that play into the carrying capacity, but there is a limit. If the population exceeds or goes above this carrying capacity, some of the individuals are going to end up dying. The ecosystem just can't support them. If they don't die, they don't die probably because they end up leaving to go to another location. They find another area to live that can support them. And so the things that help to determine the carrying capacity of an ecosystem are called limiting factors. So we're going to take a look at what limiting factors are, how biotic factors can be limiting factors, how abiotic factors can be limiting factors that help to determine the carrying capacity of a particular ecosystem. We have here a picture of a forest fire. Yes, it could kind of look like a sunset, but I think it is actually a forest fire that is raging back there in the background, which could be considered to be an abiotic factor, and it's an abiotic factor that in this case is going to limit the number of organisms that are able to survive in that particular ecosystem. So a limiting factor, its definition, is an abiotic or biotic factor that limits the number of individuals that can live in an ecosystem. It keeps populations from becoming too large. Actually, I want to go back to that for just a moment. We often think that limiting factors are a bad thing. However, at the same time, something that keeps a population from getting too large keeps a population from suffering. We wouldn't want to have especially when it comes to animals, maybe not as much in the plant kingdom, but certainly when it comes to animals, we don't want to see them suffer, and so it is better that their population is kept from getting too large. Let's start with some biotic factors that limit other organisms, and we're going to look at the first one here as competition for food. Now we've got some sort of like groundhog or prairie dog or gopher or something here that is trying to eat something, but these birds are also competing for that same food, trying to take it right out of his mouth. Most of the time, competition for food is a little more subtle than this. It's not quite this obvious. Often it involves animals trying to get to an area before other animals, or simply getting to an area before others and having the opportunity for food or water or shelter before others get there. In this case, we're talking specifically about food. When resources are scarce, fewer of the organisms are able to survive. This makes sense. When food is scarce, fewer organisms are going to make it. There's going to be greater competition. When resources are plentiful, there's less competition and greater numbers of organisms are going to be able to survive. Another biotic factor that limits other organisms is the idea of a predator-prey relationship. Of course, a predator is the hunter, so to speak, prey being the thing that is being hunted. Very much like competition, in the predator-prey relationship, the greater the number of prey that's available, the more predators you are going to have. However, the fewer the number of prey, the fewer the number of predators that are going to survive. Eventually, there will not be enough prey or food left for those predators, and some of them will begin to die off or move to another area. Another biotic factor that limits organisms in their environments are parasitism. This is when an organism lives off a host organism and it harms that host organism in some way, sometimes to the point of death. Okay, there are a lot of examples that we could go over, but one would be worms in an animal digestive tract. Humans can get worms. It doesn't happen as much anymore, especially here in the United States, as it used to. But it can still happen. Tapeworms are probably one of the more common, not that they're very common anymore in humans anyways. But there are a lot of worms that can live in the digestive tracts of animals, and what happens is that the worms in the digestive tract absorb the nutrients that animal has consumed before the animal itself can absorb that through its digestive tract. So the worm gets the nutrients first. The animal doesn't get the nutrients that it needs. The animal suffers, becomes sick, and perhaps dies. This is why a lot of animals have to have medications called dewormers given to them to kill any worms or any worm eggs that might be living in their digestive tracts. Mistletoe in trees are actually a parasite, which is very interesting because where do we usually hear about mistletoe? Well, we typically hear about it at Christmas time, right? It's what people stand under and kiss under at Christmas time. So it has happy feelings usually, feelings of holiday and feelings of love and all those wonderful things. And yet mistletoe is a parasite that kills various kinds of trees. So why we have chosen to use mistletoe as a form of celebration, I'm not exactly sure, but technically speaking, mistletoe is a type of parasite. And then things like pine bark beetles, invade and kill pine trees. So these are all different kinds of parasites where the organism lives off a host organism, harming that host organism sometimes to the point of death. Another biotic factor that limits other organisms in the environment, disease. Okay, so outbreaks of diseases can kill off most or all of a population of organisms, whether that's a population of plants or animals or bacteria or whatever it may be. One example would be the influenza outbreak in 1918, the pandemic then. Of course, this particular slideshow was created before the most recent pandemic caused by COVID. But in both cases, millions of people have died both as a result of influenza in and around 1918 and of course COVID-19 in and around 2020. The interesting thing, I guess, about influenza, which we typically shorten to call the flu, and COVID, are that they are actually viruses, and it is questionable as to whether or not viruses are actually biotic. Scientists disagree on whether or not viruses are alive, making them biotic, or whether they are actually not a living thing, which would make them abiotic. There are, however, a lot of other biotic diseases, such as Lyme disease, which is carried by ticks, and it's actually a bacteria that lives in the tick. When the tick bites an animal or a human, that bacteria enters the bloodstream and causes illness if it is not treated in time. So certainly Lyme disease would definitely be a biotic factor. Deer ticks carry Lyme disease, and it definitely can limit population of deer. It can have devastating effects on a deer population. It also causes harm to anything else that it might bite, such as dogs or humans or things like that. Some of you may actually know some people who have had Lyme disease, or perhaps you yourself have had Lyme disease at some point. If so, I hope that you are able to get it treated soon and that it has not become a lingering issue for you. Another biotic factor that limits organisms in their environment would be human activities. Humans do a lot of things that end up destroying both animal and plant habitats, whether it be by building new developments, damming up rivers, clear cutting forests. All of these things can have sometimes devastating effects on certain populations. And so as humans, we have been given by God the task of being stewards of this creation that He has made for us. And so it is important that we consider the repercussions of our actions. Certainly, we need to be able to create various types of development in order for the survival of human life. And there are other things that we need to be able to do, but we have to consider what kinds of effects those are going to have on other types of life as well when we do those things, and try and weigh the consequences. There are never any perfect answers. We live in a sinful world that is not perfect, and so often when these types of decisions need to be made, there is no perfect answer. But we need to do our best to come up with the best decision. Let's start taking a look at how some abiotic factors limit organisms in an ecosystem. We've been looking at living things and how they can limit other organisms, but now we're going to take a look at how abiotic or non-living factors can actually limit organisms. So for instance, the sun. The more availability there is of sun, that increases the amount of photosynthesis that can take place in populations of plants. And so you'll actually see plants compete for sunlight by trying to grow taller than those plants around them. You'll see this among trees in a heavily forested area. Temperature can also limit organisms. So warm, lush areas tend to support much greater numbers of populations. There tends to be less competition because there is more food available. So in these warm areas, you tend to have more plant life, and plant life is where the food sources begin, and so there tends to be less competition occurring when in warmer areas. However, in cold, harsh areas, there are fewer populations because there's a greater competition for food going on. And so temperature can have quite an effect upon the number of organisms living in an area and the variety of populations that might be there. Other abiotic factors that limit organisms in an ecosystem would include soil. So what kind of soil is in that ecosystem? If it is nutrient-rich soil that produces more carbon and nitrogen, phosphorus, things of that sort, then a larger number of populations and larger populations can be supported because there'll be better plant life because of the rich soil, which can then cause more plants to be able to grow. However, if the area has poor soil that does not have many nutrients in it, doesn't have the amount of carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus that is necessary to support a lot of plant life, then you're going to have smaller populations because there's going to be more competition for food. Another abiotic factor that limits organisms in an ecosystem would be water. And usually when we think of water, we think of the availability of water. But there's more to it than that. Certainly, there needs to be water available. But we also need to consider what kind of movement does this water have. If it is a rushing river, then there are certain types of life that are going to thrive in that kind of environment, whereas others that cannot really survive when the water moves a lot. If the water is very still, again, you have some things that can survive there very well, but others that cannot. So what kind of life is going to be there and what kinds of populations are going to be there can be dependent upon what the movement of the water is, not just availability of water. Temperature of water also makes a difference because some organisms are very sensitive to the temperature of water, especially when we think of plants or fish that live in water. Some need very cold, some need very warm, some can survive in a wide variety of temperatures. Saltiness, how salty is the water, that's going to determine what kinds of populations can live there. And then chemical components of the water. We've talked about this if you were at PCA in 6th grade when we talked about water quality. We talked about how the temperature of water can affect things. We talked about salinity, and we also talked about some of the chemical components that can affect the quality, whether or not the water is polluted, or whether or not there's a lot of oxygen in the water. All of these things can affect what is able to live there and therefore affects how much competition there is for food and for survival of populations. Other abiotic factors that can limit organisms in an ecosystem would be various changing conditions in the environment. So drought, flood, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. Right now in the news, there's a lot about hurricanes that can also have an effect. There are all sorts of weather type events or geologic type events that can have an effect on the survival of populations in an ecosystem. Take a look at this particular picture here. I'm not sure how realistic this picture is. It looks a little bit like it may be photoshopped, although it's a little hard to tell for certain. But if you had to take your best guess, what abiotic factor was removed from this particular ecosystem. Hopefully you have guessed that it would appear that water has been removed. The ground appears to be quite dry and cracked because of the lack of water there. So obviously this is an area that would not support life well, would not support populations of organisms living here very well. So all biotic and abiotic factors are interrelated with one another. In nature, you're going to find that if one factor is changed or removed in some way, that impacts other populations. All right, we've talked about this before, for instance, with the, as we like to refer to it, the great squirrel apocalypse of a few years ago. When the biotic factor of the number of acorns was changed, in this case it was increased, it caused a huge increase in the number of squirrels that were able to survive because there was so much food available for them. However, as their population increased and increased quickly, suddenly they had to search more for food. They needed to search more for space to survive. In doing so, it meant more squirrels crossing the road, just the higher population of them, plus their need for looking for more food sources and looking for more space caused them to cross roads more often. And then the abiotic factor of human involvement with cars caused these squirrels to come to an early demise. So then we had the passing of many squirrels on the roads that particular year. So all of these things are interrelated. We see the squirrel population go up and down depending on the number of acorns, and then as their population increases, how it gets limited by other factors such as cars and things like that. All right, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you have a great day, and if you have any questions, please let me know.